gonna make it.
When 67-year-old retired farmer Henry Wilson defied evacuation orders to check on his abandoned property one last time, he never expected to find a magnificent Mustang stallion left behind in the chaos of California's deadliest wildfire. The massive horse was trapped in a neighbor's corral with no food, no water, and flames advancing rapidly toward his location. Henry's decision to risk his life, saving a wild horse he'd never met, would trigger a chain of miraculous events that would restore his faith in purpose, community, and the incredible bonds that can form between the most unlikely companions. This is a story that proves miracles often come disguised as opportunities to help others when we need help ourselves. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more inspiring tales of courage, connection, and the wonders of the natural world. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into Henry and Blaze's unforgettable journey, a testament to the power of hope and second chances. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of redemption that changed everything? Let us know in the comments below. Henry Wilson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck as he drove through the smoke-filled roads toward his abandoned farm. The 67-year-old retired farmer had evacuated 3 days earlier when the Paradise Creek fire exploded across Northern California, but something kept pulling him back to check on the property he'd worked for 40 years. Henry wore his standard farm clothes, worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots that had walked every acre of his 160-acre spread. His gray hair showed beneath a faded baseball cap, and his lined face reflected decades of working under the California sun. Since his wife, Martha, had passed 2 years ago, the farm had been his only companion, and leaving it felt like abandoning family. Just a quick look, Henry told himself, as ash fell like snow on his windshield. The fire had jumped Highway 20 during the night, and authorities had extended evacuation orders to include his valley. Most neighbors had already fled, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned livestock that couldn't be evacuated in time. The smoke was so thick that Henry almost missed it, a desperate whinnying coming from the Hendersons' property next to his own. The young couple had evacuated with their children, but hadn't mentioned anything about horses when they said goodbye at the emergency shelter. Henry stopped his truck and peered through the orange-tinted gloom toward the sound. In a small corral behind the Henderson house, a magnificent Mustang stallion paced frantically along the fence line. The horse was coal-black with a distinctive white blaze down his face, easily 16 hands tall and powerfully built. "What the hell?" Henry muttered, grabbing his binoculars from the truck. Through the lenses, he could see the stallion's condition clearly. No food in the corral, water trough bone dry, and the horse showing signs of severe dehydration and panic. Henry's farmer instincts told him immediately what had happened. The Hendersons had probably been caring for the Mustang temporarily, perhaps as part of a wild horse adoption program. When the evacuation order came suddenly, they'd had to choose between saving their children and saving a wild horse they barely knew. The stallion, whom Henry would later name Blaze for his white facial marking, was trapped in a corral that had become a death sentence. The wooden fencing was too high for him to jump, and the gate was secured with a chain that the panicked horse couldn't manipulate. "Easy, boy," Henry called out as he approached the corral, though his voice was barely audible over the roar of approaching flames on the distant ridge. The fire was moving faster than predicted, and Henry estimated he had maybe 2 hours before it reached the valley floor. Blaze's reaction to Henry's presence was immediate and dramatic. The stallion reared up against the fence, his powerful hooves striking the wooden rails as he tried to escape this new threat. Wild Mustangs had no positive associations with humans, and Blaze saw Henry as another danger in an already terrifying situation. "I'm not here to hurt you," Henry said softly, though he knew the horse couldn't understand his words. "I'm here to get you out of this death trap." Henry's mind raced as he assessed the situation. Opening the corral gate would free Blaze, but a panicked wild stallion could easily injure or kill an elderly man who got in his way. Leaving Blaze trapped meant certain death when the fire arrived. Taking the horse to safety meant somehow convincing a terrified wild animal to trust a human he'd never met. As Henry fumbled with the chain securing the gate, he could see the flames cresting the ridge above them. Orange light flickered through the smoke, and the temperature was rising noticeably even at this distance. Time was running out for both of them. The moment the gate swung open, Blaze exploded out of the corral like a force of nature, nearly trampling Henry in his desperate bid for freedom. But instead of running toward safety, the confused stallion galloped directly toward the approaching fire, his survival instincts overwhelmed by panic and disorientation from the smoke. Henry realized with growing horror that saving Blaze was going to require much more than simply opening a gate. Henry jumped into his pickup truck and followed Blaze's desperate flight toward the advancing fire line, his heart pounding as he watched the magnificent stallion head directly into the path of destruction. The smoke was so thick that Blaze couldn't see the danger ahead, and his wild instincts were leading him towards certain death. "Come on, old truck," Henry muttered as he pushed his vehicle across the rough pasture land, trying to intercept Blaze before the horse reached the fire's leading edge. At 67, Henry hadn't attempted anything this physically demanding in years, but something about the trapped stallion had awakened protective instincts he thought he'd lost when Martha died. Blaze was running blind through the smoke, stumbling over irrigation ditches and fence lines he couldn't see. The stallion's panic was complete. He was no longer thinking, just reacting to the overwhelming sensory assault of smoke, heat, and the approaching roar of the wildfire. Henry managed to get ahead of Blaze and position his truck as a barrier, forcing the stallion to stop his headlong rush toward the flames. The horse reared and spun, looking for escape routes, while Henry slowly climbed out of his vehicle with his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy, Blaze," Henry said, using the name that had come to him the moment he had seen the horse's distinctive white marking. "I know you're scared, but running that way means death for both of us." The stallion's dark eyes were wide with terror as he assessed this elderly human who had appeared in his path. Blaze's coat was lathered with sweat, and his breathing was labored from the combination of panic and smoke inhalation. Henry could see that the horse was on the verge of complete exhaustion. "Listen to me, boy," Henry continued, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone he'd used with livestock for 4 decades. "I've worked with horses my whole life, and I know you can understand tone, even if you don't know words." Henry began moving slowly toward his truck's trailer hitch, where he kept a lead rope for emergencies. Getting a rope on a panicked wild stallion was normally impossible, but these weren't normal circumstances. If Henry couldn't somehow convince Blaze to follow him to safety, they would both die in the approaching fire. The breakthrough came when Blaze seemed to recognize that Henry was offering help rather than representing a threat. The stallion's ears flicked forward as Henry spoke, and his posture began to shift from pure panic toward cautious assessment of this unexpected situation. "That's it," Henry encouraged as Blaze took a tentative step toward him. "You're smart enough to know I'm trying to help." Getting the lead rope around Blaze's neck required every bit of Henry's experience with frightened animals. He moved with glacial slowness, speaking constantly in soothing tones while the fire crept closer to their position. When the rope finally settled around the stallion's powerful neck, both man and horse seemed to sigh with relief. "Now we run," Henry said, leading Blaze toward his truck as the first flames became visible through the trees behind them. The stallion followed willingly, now understanding that this human represented his only chance of survival. The journey back to Henry's farm became a race against time as the fire exploded through the dry vegetation behind them. Henry drove slowly to keep pace with Blaze, who trotted alongside the truck, the lead rope providing just enough security to keep him focused on following rather than fleeing. "Almost there, boy," Henry called through his open window as they approached the relative safety of his property. The farm sat in a natural depression with irrigated fields that might provide a fire break if they were lucky. But as they reached Henry's barnyard, both man and horse realized their ordeal was far from over. The fire had jumped ahead of them through spotting, and flames were now visible on 3 sides of the property. They were trapped in what might become their final refuge with a wild stallion who still barely trusted the elderly farmer who had risked everything to save him. Henry looked at Blaze's magnificent form standing in his farmyard and realized that saving the horse might have condemned them both. But as the flames closed in around them, something miraculous began to happen that would test the bond they had formed in their desperate flight from death. Henry's farm was surrounded by walls of flame that turned the evening sky orange and filled the air with ash and burning embers. The fire had moved faster than anyone predicted, cutting off all escape routes and trapping Henry and Blaze in what might become their final sanctuary. "Well, boy, looks like we're in this together," Henry said to Blaze as they stood in the barnyard watching flames advance from 3 directions. The stallion remained close to Henry now, understanding that this human was his only ally in a world that had become completely hostile. Henry's 40 years of farming experience had taught him to prepare for disasters, and his property offered their best chance of survival. The barn sat near a large irrigation pond that he'd built for drought years, and the surrounding pastures were green from recent watering. If they could reach the pond and create a fire break, they might survive until help arrived. "Come on, Blaze," Henry said, leading the stallion toward the pond while burning embers fell around them like deadly snow. "Time to see if an old farmer and a wild horse can outsmart a wildfire." Blaze followed Henry willingly, his wild instincts now completely focused on the human who had become his anchor in the chaos. The bond between them had deepened through shared danger, and the stallion seemed to understand that their survival depended on cooperation. Henry began flooding the pasture around the pond, using his irrigation system, creating a wet perimeter that might slow the fire's advance. Blaze watched with obvious intelligence as Henry worked, and when the farmer struggled to move a heavy irrigation pipe, the stallion positioned himself to help bear the weight. "You're something special," Henry gasped as Blaze assisted with the physical labor of preparing their defense. "I've never seen a horse understand human intentions this quickly." The most dangerous moment came when wind-driven flames jumped across the irrigation ditch and began consuming the barn where Henry stored his equipment and emergency supplies. Both Henry and Blaze were forced to retreat to the pond itself, standing chest-deep in water while burning debris fell around them. "Stay close to me," Henry instructed as Blaze pressed against his side in the water. The stallion's natural fear of confinement was overcome by his trust in Henry, and he remained perfectly still even when burning branches crashed into the pond around them. They spent 4 hours in the water together as the fire raged through Henry's property, destroying buildings and equipment he'd accumulated over decades of farming. Henry found himself talking to Blaze constantly, sharing memories of Martha, stories about the farm, and hopes for their survival. "Martha would have loved you," Henry told the stallion as they waited for the flames to pass. "She always said I needed something to care about besides the farm. Guess she sent you to me." Blaze's response was to rest his massive head against Henry's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that brought tears to the old farmer's eyes. In the space of one terrifying day, a wild stallion had become family in ways Henry hadn't experienced since losing his wife. When dawn finally broke through the smoke, Henry and Blaze emerged from the pond to survey a landscape transformed by fire. The barn was gone, along with most of the outbuildings, but the house had survived, and the irrigated fields had created enough of a fire break to save the core of the property. "We made it, boy," Henry said, wrapping his arms around Blaze's neck as the stallion nuzzled his shoulder. "We actually made it." But their survival was just the beginning of what would become a miraculous transformation for both of them. As rescue teams arrived to assess fire damage, they would discover something that challenged everything they thought they knew about relationships between humans and wild horses. The miracle Henry and Blaze had created together in their fight for survival was about to inspire an entire community and prove that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. Their story of mutual rescue was just beginning, and the best was yet to come. 2 weeks after the fire, Henry's property had become an unofficial sanctuary for displaced animals and their owners who had lost everything in the disaster. News of the elderly farmer who had risked his life to save a wild stallion had spread through the fire-affected communities, attracting people who needed to believe in hope after losing everything. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a 42-year-old veterinarian with long black hair and compassionate brown eyes, arrived to check on Blaze's condition after hearing about the remarkable bond between the retired farmer and the wild horse. Her examination revealed something that shocked her professional understanding of human-animal relationships. "Henry, what you've achieved with Blaze is unprecedented," Dr. Martinez explained as she watched the stallion calmly accept medical examination while Henry held his lead rope. Wild Mustangs typically require months of specialized training before they'll tolerate this level of human contact. Blaze had not only learned to trust Henry completely, but had begun seeking out the old farmer's company whenever possible. The stallion would follow Henry around the property like a massive dog, helping with farm chores and providing emotional support that Henry hadn't realized he desperately needed. "He saved me as much as I saved him," Henry admitted as he watched Blaze gently nuzzle a young girl whose family had lost their home in the fire. "Since Martha died, I've been going through the motions of living. Blaze gave me purpose again." The transformation in both Henry and Blaze was remarkable to witness. The elderly farmer, who had been withdrawn and depressed since his wife's death, was now energetic and engaged with life again. Blaze, meanwhile, had evolved from a terrified wild animal into a gentle giant who seemed to understand that his role was to provide comfort to anyone who needed it. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez marveled as Blaze allowed a traumatized child to sit on his back, while Henry provided gentle guidance. "This stallion is demonstrating therapeutic behaviors that we spend years trying to teach domestic horses." Word of the miracle partnership between Henry and Blaze reached local news outlets, bringing reporters and documentary crews to witness something that defied scientific explanation. A wild Mustang stallion was voluntarily serving as a therapy horse for fire victims, guided by an elderly farmer who had found new meaning in his golden years. "Every morning, people show up here looking for hope," Henry told news crew as they filmed Blaze interacting with fire survivors. "Blaze seems to know exactly what each person needs. Sometimes it's just a gentle touch. Sometimes it's the strength to know that survival is possible." The most remarkable development was how Blaze had begun to recognize and respond to human emotional distress. When someone arrived at the property in crisis, the stallion would immediately approach them with gentle, comforting behavior that often brought healing where traditional therapy had failed. Sarah Thompson, a 34-year-old teacher who had lost her home and classroom in the fire, became one of Blaze's most devoted visitors. "I was ready to quit teaching, quit everything," she explained as Blaze stood calmly while she brushed his coat. "Then I met this horse who survived the same fire I did, and somehow he made me believe that starting over was possible." Dr. Martinez began documenting the therapeutic interactions between Blaze and fire survivors, recognizing that they were witnessing the birth of something revolutionary in animal-assisted therapy. Blaze is self-selecting his therapy clients and adapting his behavior to their specific needs without any formal training, she reported in her research notes. But the most profound miracle was the transformation in Henry himself. The lonely widower who had been slowly fading away had become a community leader, organizing support networks for fire victims and serving as proof that it's never too late to discover a new purpose in life. Martha always said that miracles happen when we stop thinking about ourselves and start helping others, Henry reflected as he watched Blaze provide comfort to yet another family who had lost everything. "I thought saving Blaze was about rescuing a horse, but really, he rescued me." As autumn approached and the fire-damaged landscape began showing signs of recovery, Henry and Blaze had become symbols of hope and resilience for an entire region. Their story was about to inspire changes that would extend far beyond their small corner of California. 6 months after the fire, Henry's property had been transformed into the Miracle Ranch, an official nonprofit organization providing animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors throughout Northern California. What had started as one man saving one horse had grown into a revolutionary approach to disaster recovery that was attracting attention from around the world. We're seeing breakthrough results with PTSD patients who haven't responded to traditional therapy, explained Dr. Michael Chun, a 48-year-old trauma specialist with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses who had come to study the unique therapeutic environment Henry and Blaze had created. Blaze had become the lead therapy horse in a program that now included 12 rescued animals. But his bond with Henry remained the foundation of everything they accomplished. The stallion seemed to understand that his role extended beyond providing comfort. He was teaching other rescue animals how to connect with humans who had experienced trauma. Watch how Blaze introduces new animals to the therapy work. Dr. Martinez observed as the stallion guided a recently rescued mare through her first interaction with a fire survivor. He's actually training other horses to provide therapeutic support. Henry, now 68 and more energetic than he had been in years, had become an internationally recognized expert in disaster recovery and animal therapy. Universities invited him to speak about the unexpected healing power that could emerge from crisis situations, and his story with Blaze had inspired similar programs across the country. "I used to think my life was over when Martha died," Henry told a gathering of disaster response professionals. "Blaze taught me that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself in our darkest moments." The Miracle Ranch had documented over 300 successful therapy interactions, with participants reporting significant improvements in anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms after working with Blaze and the other rescue animals. Insurance companies were beginning to cover the therapy sessions, recognizing their effectiveness compared to traditional treatments. Maria Santos, a 29-year-old social worker with curly brown hair and warm eyes, had joined the ranch full-time to coordinate the therapy programs and document their outcomes. "What we're seeing here challenges fundamental assumptions about trauma recovery," she explained to visiting researchers. "These animals are providing healing that medication and counseling alone couldn't achieve." The most remarkable development was how Blaze had begun training human volunteers to work with trauma survivors. The stallion would demonstrate specific approaches for different types of emotional distress, essentially teaching people how to provide more effective support to those in crisis. "He's become a teacher," Henry marveled as he watched Blaze show a new volunteer how to approach someone experiencing a panic attack. "This horse is educating humans about healing techniques that he developed instinctively." The ranch's success had attracted funding from major foundations and government grants, allowing Henry to expand the program while maintaining its core philosophy of mutual healing between humans and animals. Every rescue animal that joined the program had experienced trauma, creating authentic connections with human survivors. "Both the animals and the people understand what it means to lose everything and fight to rebuild," Dr. Chen documented in his research. That shared experience creates bonds that traditional therapy relationships can't replicate. The most touching moment came when the Henderson family, who had originally been caring for Blaze before the evacuation, returned to visit the ranch. Their young daughter, Emma, now 8 years old with blonde pigtails and bright blue eyes, had been traumatized by the fire and their forced abandonment of Blaze. "I thought Blaze died because we left him," Emma confessed as the stallion gently nuzzled her hands. "I felt bad every day." Blaze's reunion with the Henderson family provided closure for everyone involved, demonstrating that the miracle of survival and healing extended to all who had been touched by the original crisis. The stallion's forgiveness and obvious joy at seeing them again helped heal guilt that had been weighing on the family for months. As winter approached, Henry looked out over a property that bore no resemblance to the lonely farm he'd been ready to abandon just 1 year earlier. The Miracle Ranch was thriving, Blaze was healthy and purposeful, and hundreds of people had found healing through the program they had created together. But the greatest miracle was yet to come, as their story was about to inspire changes in disaster response and trauma therapy that would benefit communities around the world. 1 year after the Paradise Creek fire, Henry and Blaze's story had become the foundation for a new field of study called crisis bond therapy, recognized by major universities and implemented in disaster response protocols worldwide. The elderly farmer and the wild stallion had proven that the most profound healing often emerges from the most unlikely partnerships. What Henry and Blaze discovered has revolutionized our understanding of trauma recovery, announced Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a 52-year-old psychology professor with silver hair and passionate blue eyes, during the first international conference on animal-assisted crisis recovery held at the Miracle Ranch. The ranch now hosted researchers, trauma specialists, and disaster response teams from around the globe who came to study the therapeutic methods that had emerged naturally from Henry and Blaze's survival bond. Their approach was being replicated in fire-damaged communities across California, Australia, and Greece. The key insight is that healing accelerates when both human and animal have experienced similar trauma, explained Dr. Martinez, who had become the ranch's chief research coordinator. Traditional therapy animals are trained to provide comfort, but rescue animals provide understanding. Henry had been invited to address the United Nations Disaster Response Committee about incorporating animal-assisted therapy into international relief efforts. At 68, the retired farmer found himself traveling the world to share lessons learned from one desperate night fighting fire alongside a terrified stallion. Blaze taught me that miracles aren't supernatural events, Henry told the UN Assembly. They're what happen when ordinary beings choose to help each other survive impossible circumstances. Blaze, now recognized as the first certified crisis recovery horse, continued to serve as the ranch's lead therapist while training a new generation of rescue animals. His intelligence and empathy had been documented in peer-reviewed research that challenged traditional understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. The stallion's most remarkable achievement was his work with children who had experienced trauma. Blaze seemed to recognize that young survivors needed different support than adults, adapting his therapeutic approach to provide the security and playfulness that helped children process devastating experiences. He plays with them until they laugh, then comforts them when they cry. Observe Maria Santos, who had completed her doctoral thesis on Blaze's therapeutic methods. This horse understands childhood trauma recovery better than most trained professionals. The Miracle Ranch had expanded to include educational programs for veterinarians, social workers, and disaster response teams who wanted to incorporate animal-assisted therapy into their work. Henry's practical wisdom combined with Blaze's intuitive healing abilities created training programs that were being implemented internationally. The most significant recognition came when the American Psychological Association established the Henry Wilson and Blaze Award for Innovations in Trauma Therapy, acknowledging that a retired farmer and a rescued Mustang had contributed more to the field than decades of traditional research. We thought we were saving each other from a fire, Henry reflected during the award ceremony as Blaze stood calmly beside him on stage. We had no idea we were creating a new way to heal from life's disasters. The ranch's success had inspired legislation protecting disaster-displaced animals and funding programs that connected trauma survivors with rescue animals. Henry's story proved that crisis situations could become opportunities for transformational healing when approached with courage and compassion. Emma Henderson, now 9 years old, had become one of the ranch's youngest volunteers, working with Blaze to help other children overcome trauma. Her own healing journey from guilt and fear to confidence and purpose demonstrated the long-term impact of the miracle that had begun with one man's decision to save one horse. Blaze taught me that being scared doesn't make you weak, Emma explained to new participants in the children's program. It makes you brave when you help others, even though you're scared too. As Henry approached his 69th birthday, he looked back on a year that had transformed him from a lonely widower into a global advocate for compassionate disaster response. The Miracle Ranch employed 12 full-time staff members, hosted researchers from 6 countries, and provided therapy services to over 1,000 trauma survivors annually. Martha would be amazed, Henry told Dr. Martinez as they watched Blaze lead a therapy session with wildfire survivors from 3 different states. She always said I had more to give than I realized. Took a wild horse to show me she was right. Blaze's legacy extended far beyond individual healing to systemic changes in how communities respond to disaster trauma. The stallion had demonstrated that recovery wasn't just about rebuilding structures and infrastructure. It was about rebuilding the connections between beings that make survival meaningful. Every person who finds healing here carries that hope into their community. Henry observed as participants in the ranch's programs returned to their hometowns as advocates for innovative trauma therapy. Blaze and I started something that will keep growing long after we're gone. The miracle that began with an elderly farmer's decision to save a trapped horse had become a movement that was transforming disaster recovery around the world, proving that the greatest changes often start with simple acts of courage performed by ordinary beings in extraordinary circumstances. Henry and Blaze's incredible journey from a desperate rescue during California's deadliest wildfire to founding a revolutionary trauma therapy program proves that miracles aren't magical events. They're what happens when courage meets compassion in the face of impossible circumstances. Their story shows us that our greatest purpose often reveals itself in our darkest moments, and that the healing we provide to others becomes the healing we receive ourselves. The Miracle Ranch stands as a testament to the transformative power of choosing hope over despair and action over resignation. Henry's decision to risk his life for a trapped Mustang didn't just save Blaze. It created a legacy of healing that has touched thousands of lives and changed how the world responds to trauma and disaster. Today, crisis bond therapy programs inspired by Henry and Blaze operate on 5 continents, providing hope and healing to trauma survivors while giving rescue animals purpose and family. Their story continues to inspire new approaches to disaster recovery that recognize the profound connections between all beings seeking to survive and thrive. If this tale touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of hope, resilience, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in the fiercest storms, there's always a chance for renewal. And let us know in the comments, what lesson did you take away from Henry and Blaze's journey? Thank you for joining us today, and remember, together, we can ensure that stories like this inspire a better future for all living beings.